Hey gang, it's me again. Not a guide video this time, but something else fun and hopefully engaging to break up the usual types of videos I do. As you probably guessed, this is going to be a discussion on survival mode. As many of you have probably experienced in your time in the long dark, there's a difficulty curve from just starting out to getting some gear to being on top of the food chain. Pretty much every game, especially survival games, have a form of a difficulty curve that's detectable by presenting you with a challenge and allowing you to find tools or whatnot to overcome that challenge. Then, of course, you feel on top of the world, obviously, or at least that tiny portion, and the game's going to present you with another challenge, and you've got to prepare for it and overcome it. And you keep going until you hit the proverbial end game wherein there's no further challenge or endpoint. Some games continue forever with procedurally generated content and challenges so that it never ends, and others offer you the opportunity to hash it out with other players in the same league as you. The thing to note about these situations is that the game is specifically designed around these challenges and this curve to make it both engaging and fun, but also challenging. Man, I really need to find a new word to use, don't I? So, where does sandbox mode in the long dark fall? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that in the early stages of development, Sandbox was simply a testbed for the mechanics and assets that would be used in story mode. Obviously, this changed over time as Sandbox became its own viably and equally sought after portion of the game. This means that Sandbox, at least originally, wasn't designed around this difficulty curve aspect. That's not to say that Hinterland hasn't made any additions or changes to Sandbox to make it different or harder in some regards. But one thing that still sticks out like a sore thumb to me is this. There's no expanding, variable, ever-changing, or even predictable difficulty curve resulting in what would be considered a satisfying or engaging end game in the long dark. As it stands, and if you've seen my guide videos, you know I've talked about this before, there's only two portions of Sandbox Challenge, early game and mid game. To recap, if you've not seen or heard me discuss it before, Sandbox starts you out with nothing, and the challenges get to get things in order to survive, and depending on the experience mode you've chosen, you'll also have to contend with hostile wildlife in addition to the elements. Then, you hit the mid-game once you've gotten good clothing and tools and you can hunt, fish, and trap to supply you with food and hides for crafted clothing. There's a decline in the weather that peaks later in the easier modes and sooner in the harder. As it stands, it's basically just a decline in global average daily temperatures. In all my time playing, I've yet to really experience weather get drastically worse over time past that point. It does still decline a little bit, but it sometimes is in areas confusing as to how cold it can get for just one off day, and other days it's like, why am I still this warm? Maybe more variable and unpredictable and changing faster, but not categorically worse. There's still plenty of good days to go out and explore and collect things or hunt. So what does this mean for Sandbox players currently? Well, as it stands, there's a great many of us in the community who enjoy playing Sandbox despite its current shortcomings. However, there's also many of us clamoring, "Hey, it's me!" for the challenge to come to Sandbox that's been lacking. A good number of the community enjoys starting new runs just to get them to the mid game and then off of them to start over again because they feel like there's no challenge after the mid game. The challenge is all in the beginning, getting set up. Some could argue to go up to a different experience mode, but not everyone enjoys the change from Voyager to Stalker, Stalker to Lober. It's not necessarily a stock difficulty increase, but a change in the way the game is given to you that forces a playstyle change to succeed, which could be considered more difficult, but I'm not going to delve into semantics. That's not what I'm here for to discuss today. So the question I've been asking myself, and I've seen asked around a lot, is how could we go about making Sandbox more challenging and more fun? What changes could we make to it that wouldn't turn off new players, but would also give credible challenge later on in your run in creative ways? What things could we change in the existing mechanics to allow for a more granular and perceptible change over time that leads to a more engaging, intriguing, and of course, challenging run as time wears on? Obviously, I'm no game developer. I took a class on it in high school, and I've been a purveyor of playing games long before then, and especially since then. But I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert on the subject by any means. Which is to say, while I can think of some good ideas, they may not flow well with the game in general, or be able to be properly implemented. So take what I'm about to say into consideration with a grain of salt. So the current mechanics of the game present difficulty to the player in three main ways. Your needs bars, which need to be fulfilled, requiring you to find rest, food, etc. the weather outside, which makes you cold and forces you indoors at times, and hostile wildlife. As time goes on in any run, the weather gets colder, resources start to run out, and non-hostile wildlife, as well as hostile wildlife, begins to respawn slower after hunting, meaning you have to range further to get food. As it stands, this can provide a decent level of challenge, especially for newer players, but even this, as it degrades over time, it doesn't create a meaningful challenge, nor is it really a challenge for long-time players who have extensive map knowledge and game knowledge. It just means they move a little more. So what can we do to make the game scale differently for the player in a way that would be meaningful, still provide them with a way to overcome it, and engage the player to think about how they handle situations in different ways to provide a more immersive and emerging survival mode experience? Well, I've thought long and hard about some things that could be added or changed that would positively affect this, and could hopefully be scaled in ways to match the existing experience modes. So obviously, one of the primary factors in the long dart is the weather. In the early part of any run, you're going to be cold because you have poor gear. But as the game runs on and as your run continues, it gets increasingly colder. This is fine. It forces you to either find or craft better clothing to survive the cold. Here's the problem. It basically hits a ceiling as to how cold it gets. Sort of. Now, that's not to say I'm advocating that they allow it to get colder just indefinitely completely. What I am saying, though, is that weather patterns themselves should also have some degradation to them. I've discussed it before, but if you've not noticed, there's distinct weather patterns in each region. And of course, the variability of how they change and how fast they do scales with the higher experience modes. And to a degree, the variability in which they change goes down as well as time goes on. But ultimately, that's all that changes, is the amount of variance and the rate at which it happens, which makes it completely random. Now, for certain things in games, it's nice to have randomness. It makes it unpredictable. That's fine. But the problem is it doesn't scale well, nor provide an adequate challenge at times. So, for example, you could have periods where, due to the randomness, you're completely blessed, so to speak, and you can pursue all activities fairly at any point in time with no challenge from the weather, and other times you could be punished unduly just because the randomness of it decided to roll 20 blizzards in a week. So what could be changed with the weather to actually make it harder? And in a good way, not just for the sake of existing either. Well, there's a few adjustments that could be made that would probably fit well. One would be probably only in the higher difficulties, but after a certain point, randomly deciding a set of days to be super bad. Think non-stop blizzards, followed by dense fog and high winds, and back to blizzard again. Just a really bad storm. Think of it as if like a storm system had actually moved in. And it would last for a day or two or three or maybe even a week, and then you'd be back to normal, but variable weather. This would force the player to plan ahead and stock up on food and water for when these storms hit. An onslaught of back-to-back untravelable days of weather forces the players indoors and away from exploring. The only problem with this, though, is you've got to balance it properly so that the player isn't just plain forced into cabin fever because, why not? Bad storm! Waha! It would need to have indicators that it's coming, perhaps some changes to the skybox to indicate a massive storm is coming in a day or two, maybe scaling cabin fever back during the storm period, a lessening of wildlife in the region, a massive amount of weather crows leaving, or weird oddities in the weather. Something to signify that it's coming. I'm not certain how to balance it properly, but this changes it from just pure randomness and cold with weather to certain periods where you know you're going to get messed up if you're not prepared for it. I'm not certain if this would provide a meaningful advance in late game difficulty or if it would just exist and be an annoyance. But this is a change to the weather system that might be worth looking at to increase late game difficulty. So, just some things to think about there, some ways we could potentially change the way weather functions in the game to be more punishing in a fair way later on in the runs. The next area that could be looked at is hostile wildlife. As it stands, animal AI is rather easy to predict and oftentimes quite buggy, with animals getting stuck in weird loops or odd terrain features. So firstly, you'd obviously need to give pathing and navigational AI a repass to fix those issues. But let's ignore that aspect for a minute and discuss wolves, the primary tangible antagonist of the game in every experience mode sans Pilgrim. As it stands, wolves work individually, take basically, sans a few caveats, no input or activity from other wolves into consideration, and don't work in a pack structure. You can find multiple wolves in the same area, but they don't work together. There's no creative, cohesive whole. So one super big change that could have a massive late game effect on difficulty would be an implementation of wolf pack behavior. Of course, it would be a huge update and change to the AI, and you'd have to balance it right and make sure that it integrates well with the existing game mechanics. But I've got a few ideas on how it could be done in a way that I think would be meaningful. Firstly, the concept of scaling needs to be discussed. Think of how cold is handled in the game currently. A similar system would need to be implemented wherein the wolf pack gets linearly more dangerous as time progresses in the run. So you could have a pack and 1 or 2 wolves would be the scouts. Now these scouts, they'd have a wide patrol range and would path around their territory looking for either deer, bunnies, or the player. Possibly eventually the moose too, though that brings up other balance questions, so we'll leave that out for now. For the sake of our example, let's say one of the scouts found you as you were exploring. Instead of handling it like it currently is, the wolf would go into attack mode and stalk you down, and eventually, if the conditions merit it, charge you and attack you. In this instance, though, for the scout, the wolf would go into stalk mode only. He would just follow you but never engage, and he would try to stick to sides or trees and not directly behind you, a fair distance away. At periods, the scout wolf would stop and howl to alert the pack to his location and then proceed to follow. The pack would go from wherever their den is or to wherever they're out hunting or exploring to follow the scout. And this would work kind of similarly to how scent works right now, which I'll give a brief description on. When a wolf scents you, he heads to that specific location to where he scented you. So if you were at, say, a fishing hut in Coastal Highway and he scented you there, and you left that fishing hut and went towards the fishing camp, the wolf would first path to that fishing hut and then smell for you again, and then head for that next node of wherever you were where he smelled you next. So the scouting would have to work in a similar fashion to where the wolf howled in a specific way to alert the pack. The pack would head towards that last location of the howl, and then as the scout continues to track you and would howl occasionally, they would move on again to come up to that, and they would move at a rapid pace. Not full out sprint, but a trot to get up to those locations faster compared to the scout just following you at walking speed. So how would this positively impact the gameplay difficulty and scale with time? Well, early on, you'd have the local wolf den with its pack, maybe 1, 2, or 3 packs on map, depending, per map I should say, region, depending on the experience mode. They'd have their stalkers out, 1 or 2, patrolling their territory, so a wolf pack would have a specific portion of the map it covers. In the early game, as they find the player, they would only stalk the player and maybe alert the pack to their location, but would be far more cautious and reserved. This would allow the player to be able to explore the region with a tolerable level of threat management without having to worry about being hunted by a pack of 4 or 5 wolves constantly, but knowing that if they don't deal with the situation, if they end up getting found by a scout, they could end up in hot water. It would still need to be possible, if the player's in rough shape, for the scout wolf to just ignore his pack and attempt to go in for the kill himself. Anyway, as the game scales on, the scout wolf would get more opportunistic. Upon locating the player, he would immediately stalk the player, make sure its presence is known to the pack, and within a minute or two, begin to try and get the pack in close and the hunt would be on. The player would need to either eliminate the scout wolf or find shelter quickly to avoid being cornered by the entire pack. You could balance this in many ways or change the features of how this works. You'd need the pack to exist, of course, so if the player walked into the territory between scouts and wasn't detected, he could find the main body of the pack roaming about, thus making exploration in unknown areas still a risk-reward format. Either getting stalked by the scout for a while and then ambushed by the pack, or else just running pell-mell into the pack by accident, whatever. The pack would also need to be programmed to work as a unit, so some would try to corner you while others attempted to flank or head off the route you're heading on. Overall, this would provide a major boost to late game difficulty if it could be implemented properly and scale with both experience mode and time. I.e., the scouts would start out cautious and scared of the player, but as time goes on, they get more aggressive in stalking and alerting the pack to the intruder's presence. Having the pack roam as one through the territory at times instead of just the scout finding you. The whole pack may just be on the hunt immediately if you're in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Fires would be super effective in these situations, allowing the player time to ward them off and possibly shoot them while they wait nearby. Again, this would need to be implemented in depth and balanced correctly, and it would be a major overhaul of the wolves in the game. But I feel like this type of change would benefit the game well and the difficulty curve as a whole. Think of a late game situation where you've got to get through an area guarded by wolves. You'll have to attempt to stealth in possibly poor weather conditions and hope the scouts don't scent you or find you, or you don't accidentally stumble into the pack itself. Obviously, this would be a massive overhaul of existing animal AI and wolf mechanics, and everything would have to be carefully balanced properly and would be a massive undertaking. However, I think the concept of having wolf packs and wolves occupying specific territories, and not just random, wolves and sometimes groups of wolves pathing in a specific unit, etc. This is just my opinions, and it may not be feasible, it may not be possible, and even if it were, it may not implement well, I don't know. But this is something I've thought long and hard about and messed around with different concepts in my head and on paper to see how they would work out, and I think it's a great idea. But then again, I'm just me, and that could be my subjective opinion. Alright, moving on from wolves. Food. Obviously, once you used up all the processed food in the game, it's time to eat rabbits, cattails, huntable game, and fish. As it currently stands, the respawn rates after kill increases as the game drags on, but again, that reaches a cap. It's still easy enough to feed yourself hundreds of days into the game with proper wildlife management. So what could be changed here? Well, a forced eviction. So if the player cannot find food near their base of operations, they'd be forced to pack up and leave. So let's say you spend more than 20 days in a singular region after a certain point in the run, which would need to vary based off of which mode you picked. Wildlife would start to dwindle, regardless of you hunting it, until it had completely vacated the region. This would include hostile wildlife. This would force the player to have to pack up and leave that region to go to another one where there is food available. This engages the player to make risk-reward decisions and plan ahead for staying alive. This could be randomized to include the player's current location or region and one random other region as well, so that the player may have to search a bit to find food. Will this actually be engaging and provide meaningful difficulty in the late game? Yeah, I don't know. This is one thing that on paper kind of looks and sounds really cool, but in actual gameplay, would this just be engaging, or would it just be something that exists that you have to plan around and is just annoying? Well, I've just spent weeks collecting hides in this region to supply my repair needs for the foreseeable future, and oh my, would you look at that, now there's no food left. Guess I'll just have to leave now, eh? Well, it would have to be balanced properly, obviously. One of the things that would be interesting here is if you planned ahead, you'd have free roam of the region for a few days, as the local wolf packs would have abandoned it too, so exploration would be safe from all harm sans weather. Another implementation that could come after wolf packs is wolves actively hunting, which would, regardless of the above mentioned thing about food, which would add added difficulty for the player. Now, with current existence of wolves, if a rabbit or deer comes across their path, they'll hunt it down and eat it. That's cool, it adds some immersion, but it doesn't provide much of an actual gameplay feature most of the time. If wolf packs were implemented, this could become interesting, as the player would also have to compete with the local wildlife when it comes to food. So this could also stack with the above mentioned ideas on wildlife scarcity, or maybe not. So imagine, say, you're out for a stroll on Coastal Highway, and you see a wolf pack off in the distance dispatching a local herd of deer. There just went several weeks worth of food, and you can't recover it unless you attempt to barge in and steal it from the entire pack of wolves. This could become an engaging change to late game difficulty, as now you're attempting to survive, but actually full on attempting to compete with a hostile force to acquire your food. So it wouldn't just be you as a person on the food chain needing to hunt deer and rabbits, etc. for food. You've also got the wolves to compete with. The total amount of available resources in a region are now split not just between your needs, but actually the local wolf pack too. One could also, if this were implemented, if they were filling up to the challenge, engage an active wolf pack just to steal their food for the sake of adrenaline and heightened challenge. Like, I've got a moose bagged up at home, but hey, here's a wolf pack hunting a herd of deer, let's just barge on in here. This wouldn't necessarily be forced on the player, but would it be a possibility that might become very intriguing to those of us who love tangling with wolves on the daily. Anyway, these are just some thoughts I've thought of. I've obviously got more thoughts I'm thinking on, but haven't fleshed out completely. But the two I like the most are Wolfpack implementation and then competing for food sources. Because then, you've got to plan around your own food sources for your own needs, but then you've also got to factor in how the wolves and hostile wildlife are engaging with the whole food chain and ecosystem, and how to manage that properly would add another layer of difficulty that could be very immersive and engaging, but again, would depend on implementation. Anyway, I've been Lonely Wolf. These have been my thoughts on survival mode. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Until then, stay safe and stay warm out there.